we're back with Still Left Out in America. Hey, Matthew, how are you?
I'm doing great. It's good to see you, Pat.
Yeah, it's always fun when we can get a podcast time together rather than doing the individual ones.
Right. We seem to have this this thing of having really busy schedules that just are a good challenge.
Yeah. So anyway, we both wanted to be on this one because we've got two preeminent authorities on one of my favorite all-time authors. I don't know how you feel about him, Kurt Vonnegut Jr. Just amazing. Joining us today is Max Goller from Teaching Vonnegut. Max has spent years of his life teaching other teachers how to teach Vonnegut. And Marc Leeds, who is so smart about Vonnegut that he wrote the encyclopedia on him. The Kurt Vonnegut Encyclopedia.
You do realize I wrote that so I couldn't forget.
So one of the stories we're going to have you tell in just a second is when you were a grad student and you decided to write all things Vonnegut, and you had the audacity to write to the guy like he would write back to you. But we'll get there in a second. Yeah. And so one of the things you would ask us, Matthew and I, was how many of these podcasts we've done. And actually, I don't know how many we've done since we started the podcast itself, maybe 6 or 7.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
But we started this because of my book, Priscilla, the Princess of the Park. We really wanted to stress the fact that people, in fact, live in parks. So Matthew and I broadcast together for 17 hours.
In the park.
Webcast, yeah, from a park. And Max Donnelly, of course, the amazing Max Donnelly, our producer, produced the entire program, which was incredible. And those 17 hours got more than 10,000 views. So we decided we ought to be having a podcast.
We have an audience.
Yeah, I think so.
So now let's fly. One of the reasons we wanted to talk about Vonnegut is this podcast basically deals with poverty, food insecurity, housing insecurity, the rough patches that people in the wealthiest nation in the world run into so often, too often. And as a giant fan of Kurt Vonnegut, when I'm reading Vonnegut, I'm never alone. I feel like I'm
I'm with you.
So we wanted to talk to you guys, to you, Marc, and you, Max. So, Marc, why don't you tell us about when you were in grad school studying Vonnegut and you had the audacity to write to the man?
Well, what happened was I really did know by the time I was a candidate for the degree, passing all my exams and then having to tell them what I was going to do for a dissertation. It was first all about, believe it or not, Albert Einstein and Henry Adams and the education of Henry Adams. But after a year of studying physics, I couldn't find any faculty members who were really good enough at literature and physics, whether they were from one side or the other. And my professor at the time, leading professor, was Leslie Fiedler, who's pretty much a legend in American criticism. So he said, I told him after about a year, I said, all right, we got to do something so I could finish, because the whole idea of this is we got to get done. And he readily agreed. And he asked me what I had in mind. And I told him, and he was all for it. But he was not the chair of the department who had to sign off on it, even though Leslie was the star of the department. And that's what helped. I put in a letter to ask to write about Vonnegut, because you had to put in a letter to tell him whatever you were declaring for your dissertation, and it had to be approved by, I think it was called the Chairs Committee or something like that. So I got called in by my chairman. He says, you do know this is a living writer, don't you? I said, yes. He says, you do know that this could change at any moment. I said, well, actually, that's my position. I don't think it can, because I was pointing out a particular structure in all that repeats in all of Kurt's novels. And he said, you realize if he writes another novel and blows it for you, you're done. And don't worry about it. That's my problem. But he signed off on it because Fiedler was all for it. Fiedler loved the idea. And some of that's going to be in the new book. But yeah, I had a lot of pushback because I was going to write about a living author. And that's not really a cool thing to do. And it was a solo author I was doing. It wasn't like I was putting him in a pile with Philip K. Dick and, maybe, fill in the blank, Sturgeon, whoever it was. It was all about Kurt and the structure of his books, and which was very evident to me, but hadn't been written about. But I really had my chairman sitting on my letter for almost 3 weeks before he approved it. And I didn't contact Kurt about it. And it was my first contact with him until about 5 months later when I received my dissertation back as a bound volume they sent it off to the University of Michigan. I was at Buffalo. So now I felt official, even though I had been through graduation. And so I wrote Kurt. I told him what I had done for a dissertation.
I have a PhD in you?
Excuse me?
I have a PhD in you? You might be you, but I have a PhD in you.
Well, wait till you hear his response, because that's the best part. So I said to him, and he knew Leslie Fiedler. They were correspondents. And so I told him that I wrote about him and that what I wanted to do, I didn't tell him about the dissertation in particular, although I did tell him the title. But then I told him that I had all these reading notes because I talked about all of the books. And while I was writing it, I realized that my next project really needs to be an encyclopedia because the characters, for lack of a better term, are, by the author's whims, mutable. They change. Chief among those would be the really mean propaganda minister from Harrison Bergeron, who winds up in God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, all about the classes and impoverishment on top of that. She's the one who calls up as the feeble one and tells him her pains about her kidleys, as she describes it. Diana Moon Glampers. So where was I? So I told Kurt what I wanted to do and why I thought it was particularly important, even though he was still writing. And he wrote back in less than a week and said, I don't know anybody who's got that much time on his hands, but if you really want to spend that kind of time on me, go for it. You have my permission, because it was going to take extensive quotation. And that's what I was asking about. He says, but I don't know what I can say yes to. So he gave me the name and phone number of his lawyer/agent. And he said, contact Don Farber. And I've already contacted him and gave you my blessing. So he's just going to work out with you only details, but you can do it. And this was, I had gotten home from work at like 5:30, 6 o'clock, and this was the letter waiting for me in less than a week from my writing. The next morning at about 8 o'clock in the morning, I get a call from Don Farber, Vonneguts' agent/lawyer, who then became mine until he passed a few years ago. And Don sounded like a longshoreman. He was the best. I understand you want to do a book about Kurt. And he says it's okay. What is it you want to do? And, I'm like, I've got my heart in my throat at that point. I'm telling him all about the encyclopedia. He says, okay, do you mind if I represent you on this. I can't keep doing that because my voice will just go. And I said, yeah, sure, you know, could only help. But in the meantime, I had contacted Greenwood and was in the middle of negotiating a deal, which Dawn Faber then took over for me. And yeah, you know, we were friends after that, you know, Kurt, Dawn, myself, and they were all amazing people. In terms of my academic life, they made it because I was able to interact with the focus of my own academic interests, free from clearances, because his lawyer was my lawyer, and anything I did already had Kurt's blessing. So it was very freeing in that respect. And I understood the kind of responsibility I had at that point, because you can't screw it up. Yeah. You know, you can't just make a mockery of the task.
Were you overwhelmed by that generosity?
I was floored by it. I mean, I was, truthfully, I expected to be turned down. But it was just so nice to know that, you know, as a bright-eyed graduate student writing a dissertation on a living author, that they could be so nice and generous about it. And that, to me, really was the beginning of the way our relationship went. He became more of like the uncle I never had than anything else. Our conversations weren't often about any literary elements at all, just on a rare occasion. Our conversations were about family. He would constantly ask me about my daughters. And he always wanted me at a bigger university where I could get support for my work. Well, that wasn't going to work in part because it's just geography. But he was a great supporter. And just knowing that as you're working on this stuff, knowing that he's a living guy, but he's the one who has to sort of say, just, gee, this is good, you know? And in a sense, I didn't realize it at the time, but in a sense, I was trying to write for two people. Certainly my dissertation advisor, Leslie Fiedler, and Kurt, because I really felt like that first edition had to really put what my intention was, what the mission was, into very clear terms for a reader, which has always been an impediment for people who read Vonnegut. They seem to get stuck on things. And so I tried to explain a few things and to connect them to other books and themes and things like that.
Well, so that's what we
I guess it worked because he included me in his last novel.
I guess it did work, yeah. So that's what we want you and Max to do for us today. We want you to connect us to Kurt's opinion of people who were impoverished or the working class or down and out in one way or another. Because he really, I mean, he came from wealth until their family lost everything.
That's
and
right.
Then he went into the poverty class and famously said that, you know, his mom used to say, when things get better, we'll put you in a private school. And he dreaded that because he thought he got the best education from his public school.
That's right. And which is interesting because it just showed that he didn't have that upper class snobbery. He immediately took to his, let's just say, lower middle class roots at that point, and not just accepted it, but embraced it. He always spoke well of it. He never spoke ill about leaving private school. That was like one of the best things that ever happened to him.
Right. Max, you had some idea of what you were thinking about when we were talking earlier about some of the moments in Kurt's writing that
Yeah, what we were discussing was just, to me, how his life influenced his beliefs about things. And there was the great meeting that he had. An uncle of his uncle Alex, who is his good uncle, brought him in on a meeting with Powers Hapgood, who was a Harvard graduate, but was very down to earth and had kind of these socialist leanings and really cared about people. Got out of Harvard, and Hapgood went to work in the coal mines because he wanted to be of the people. And Kurt got to meet him. And as a result of that, Kurt kind of espoused that socialist idea. He said, to me, that whole idea of taking care of the working class and the down and out fit me perfectly. I was in the Army, and I was one of the working class and one that needed that, so it made sense to me. And I can relate to that, having been in the Navy. I didn't achieve anything magnificent in my youth, but yeah, it's just being able to relate to people that are trying to do good for the working classes of the country.
Mark is
and I think that playing off of that, Debs was particularly interesting because he came into Kurt's life early, but because he bounced from, let's say, upper class to then moderate, low, middle class to lower class, in some respects, so just having to go back to public school, I think Debs eventually gave him a framework for understanding the needs of people in ways that had the family stayed rich, he never would have understood. He would have been blind to those things. But Debs gave him a platform for understanding that all people need to be cared for. His own family is a great example. They fell from grace, so to speak, and not quite impoverished, but one realizes what happens when you have diminished capacities in those ways. So as I say, I think Debs gave him a great platform for understanding that we need to equalize opportunity.
Are you referring now to Eugene Debs and that was one of his favorite quotes, right? If there's a poverty class, I am of it. If there's
exactly.
If there's someone in prison, yeah. And his other big, he was a big fan of the Beatitudes.
Yeah, so the Sermon on the Mount was definitely a big thing for him. And the one thing, when I used to work at the museum in Indianapolis, Kurt Vonnegut Museum and Library, there was a quote that Kurt had that was basically, blessed are the happy-go-lucky boys and girls. And he told his friend Dan Wakefield that was kind of his official edit to the Sermon on the Mount, because Kurt said, this is one of my favorite sermons. It's all about taking care of people. He said, but the line, blessed are the meek, kind of tweaked him a little bit. That was the one thing that didn't seem to fit. And he found a French translation of the sermon, and it was translated to blessed are the debonair. So Kurt felt at liberty to translate that back into blessed are the happy-go-lucky. So it was his way of making the Sermon on the Mount better, if you
accessible,
if you can edit Jesus.
Well, I'm sure
Don't worry, a lot of people
Jesus
do.
didn't talk about debonair. Reverend, did Jesus ever talk about debonair?
Well, it depends on what version you read, of course, but but yeah, I mean, the whole idea of blessed is it can be translated as happy are those as well.
Yes.
And so I think that what you're saying is, it really kind of captures that entire essence in there, that there's these people and they're cared for. And so, of course, happy are those who are cared for. That's as far as I'm concerned, that's right in line with the whole essence of what it's about.
And
it's interesting. one of the things I plan on doing if I get the opportunity, which I think I have by contract in designing the next book, is I wanted the Sermon on the Mount to be the last leaf in the book, just by itself. I have something planned for the front, but it's another time.
Will you
Because
give it
it is
to us first? Will we get the scoop?
you'll hear it first. Because I do think it's that important a document for him.
I think it was an incredibly important document for him. And it's interesting that he talks about how, you know, as Christianity kind of morphed into this religion of the rich, he's like, the thing that Kurt appreciated about religion, because he was a free thinker, he was not a religious person himself, but the Sermon on the Mount was important to him because it represented taking care of people. And it disturbed Kurt to see the way that religion went after that, where that wasn't the focus anymore. So,
well, the original essence of probably any religion in the world is to take care of people.
yes.
And somewhere along the way, excuse me, Reverend, but we screwed the pooch.
I don't disagree with that. I just preached a sermon this past week on how Scripture gets abused and used for people's own purposes, and
Exactly.
it's terrible.
I don't think anything is used and abused really as the Beatitudes either. I think maybe that's the other reason he defended it so vociferously, was because people seem to claim to believe and then go against pretty much every single one of those Beatitudes.
Well, and that was always, I think, basic to Kurt's presentations in every book, to show, if not the irony of our lives, but there's a certain sardonic quality. It's really bitter. It's nefarious. And it goes against the very first principles of any religion. So he always has it in there as facing evil, if you will. Mm. It's not the philosophy of religion that sucks. It's man's execution of it that sucks.
Yeah. So, I often, the other thing I really liked about Kurt, and maybe you can point to some places where it happened, but he seemed to glorify the ordinary person, the aluminum siding salesman or the repairman was his hero, in his books, instead of it being, or the private in the concentration camp, the prisoner camp. He just made the hero out of the everyday guy. And I think it makes you feel like you're one of them when you're reading his book.
He absolutely had a pride in having been an infantryman. Not a non-commissioned officer or somebody who came out of ROTC, out of Cornell, and went in as a lieutenant. But he was an infantryman. He was the lowest of the low. And
his final rank corporal.
Sad as was his overall war experience, his actual time in battle was only 3 days. But it was a horrible, terrifying 3 days. And I believe 3 days is enough to win you the infantryman's medal. Max would know more about that than I.
Yeah, because he was taken prisoner at the Battle of the Bulge, and he, of course, had to clean up Dresden after the firebombing. So I guess maybe they can count that time as time served.
Well, and coming from that military perspective, I think Kurt got out of the military as a corporal, and that's the second rank up from the bottom in the Army. I mean,
right.
That's how low he was in the Army.
And that was basically only an elevation to give him a couple more bucks as a veteran.
Yeah.
It wasn't, he never did serve as a corporal.
Wow.
Might have come home as a corporal, but that was about it.
Yeah.
So
he was all about, that, I think back at, God bless you, Mr. Rosewater, we're talking about poverty and things like that. And the Peñas, the father and son who were out on a rowboat fishing. And the rich people are watching from the wharf through their windows while they eat lobster and other things. And they're watching, you know, these guys who are just the working class schlubs of what really was Barnstable, but of Cape Cod. And so you had the distinction even then between those guys who were long timers there, old families, middle class, people who worked with hammers or fishing rods, versus the upper class that came and transformed places like Cape Cod into a rich person's escape.
Yeah. So what book would you recommend? Give us a reading assignment to be the one book that would open a person's mind best to Kurt Vonnegut's understanding of the human condition. I realize that every book, but yeah. I didn't think it was going to be easy.
Max, you want to go first?
Well, and Pat and I were talking about this earlier, and all of them, I mean, if you look at any of his books, the one thing that is just absolutely consistent is there is that humanity in every single book. And so she was mentioning Hocus Pocus and that transformation of learning institutions into prisons and how devastating that was. Or Jailbird, with a lot of that discussion of, you know, like socialist heroes and things like that. And I think the one thing that always comes through to me in every one of his books is humanity matters above all else.
Right. And you know, it's interesting that you brought up Hocus Pocus, because whenever I speak with people about Hocus Pocus, I'm always defending it. People have trouble reading that. And I say, go back and read it without thinking about time pressure or anything else. Realize what he's talking about and the separation of people and how we categorize. But more importantly, go back to the concept that's presented in the beginning of the book. We have the whole anthropological history of the place and how it came about. And then, you know, the concept of the perpetual motion machines and how these all work. And those perpetual motion machines is really, if you will, I'm going to describe it as a capitalist caste system. And I think for me, the easiest book to always recommend about this is God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, where one would think that at the time you could read these things and say it's funny. You know, you read Senator Rosewater's speeches, and they are so right wing as to be almost comedic. But then you realize a few years after that, Richard Nixon came into being, speaking about the very same things. Also, this law and order crap that we've got now with Trump. And now we're going through that again. We're having the same set of speeches about classical Western white civilization. I wrote a piece last week about that this is the last white election in America. And thank goodness.
It's interesting you brought
One
up,
way or another, this is the end of it.
it's interesting you
Because
brought
you're
up,
not going to be able to win an election in the future with only white votes.
yeah.
It's not going to happen. So, you know, I'm glad for those things. But in terms of his clarity of message on both the capitalist system, who has money, and my God, what do they do with it when they have it? And not in all cases, but who has money, how they came by it. You know, Jefferson warned against a permanent aristocracy through inheritance. And I think that Rosewater is very much a good example of the shit that goes wrong that Jefferson was afraid of. But at the same time, it's an excellent description of a number of things Vonnegutian. Discussion of classes, discussion of what it is to be elite, a discussion about being an infantryman in World War II, having some guilt about the death of your own mother, because in Rosewater, he actually accidentally commits matricide. And of course, Kurt, along with his sister, found their mother having probably committed suicide on Mother's Day, 1944. Then there's this distinction. You get to the Rhode Island Rosewaters, and the class is completely different than that of the senator, who, though he hails from Indiana, hates to be there. But he's their senator. And this sense of non-resident representation is still going on. So to me, the book that has always held up since I first read it, for every period of my life, the clearest that he's ever written about it was Rosewater, for me. Because, you know, in the very beginning of the book, one of the best beginnings, money is a major character in this book. And when you recognize that money is a major character in life, you just get sort of stuck on that one line. And you haven't even gotten into the book yet.
Yeah, and Pat and I were discussing that exact line before this all started up. And we were also discussing this whole idea of, Kurt always had, Dan Wakefield mentioned that Kurt had this favorite saying that politics is a two-party system, but it's not the two-party system you think it is. Because the two parties are the winners and the losers, and the winners always win and the losers always lose. And
that's right.
So, you know, we were discussing earlier how the rich, the elite have used different methods to try to divide the working class, either through race or through religion or whatever it is. Because if you can
just tell them that another group is trying to take their jobs.
Yeah, if you can divide the masses,
and then you have the lower classes fighting among each other.
Yep.
I wanted to ask you guys a question. You know, a lot of times when people think about characters that authors come up with, and especially if there's like a bad guy, people always think, oh, are they thinking about this person or that? But I want to think about the kind of the heroes. Did he have a sense as far as was he thinking of somebody specific in his life that kind of ran through characters, or was it kind of just different folks that he kind of identified?
I'm going to take the position that it was all about folks, because one of the things that a lot of people pointed out about Vonnegut's writing was there's not any real heroes. There's not any real villains in Kurt Vonnegut's writing. What there is a whole bunch of humans that have both the positive and the negative in all of them. There are some that are more negative and some that are more positive, but none that you could point to as being, you know, a black or white in either case. What do you think, Mark?
I think that's perfect. And I think one of Kurt's descriptions for the fact that we all have a little bit of everything in us is in Mother Night, when he talks about the cuckoo clock in hell, where it may keep perfect time for 4 hours, 6 minutes and 16 seconds. And if for some reason it flips ahead 3 hours, you know, so you'd think that it's a real clock and it's working. And then you realize it's got its own sense of the dimensions of time. And this has always been, I think, certainly as we know that Kurt played with time travel, but this is the description of how one's mind works, that we're all pretty stupid and make excuses for why things are good for us. And we explain why things are bad. So we all have some measure of that cuckoo clock in hell, but we all hope we're within a couple of seconds of each other. And then you get, as he was describing, Nazis who, on the one hand, are these great promoters of culture, music, a certain severity in art, but it's there. Well, you could look at Melania for that. And at the same time, they're exterminating people. The very people they prized for making that music, writing that music, creating that art. And so it makes no sense. Killing the very culture that they had. But that's what people are, to one extent or another. Now, as I said, we all hope that we're within a couple of seconds of each other. We could deal with that. But when we're 16 hours off from what's going on, that's a problem.
That is a problem. So real quick, Mark, because this has been a really fun discussion and time goes too quickly, but tell us a little bit about your upcoming project. Just give us a glimpse of what you're working on.
Well, I'll first tell you, because I'm very proud of this, I was flattered because the publisher Wiley in Indiana came to me and asked me to write basically a primer about Vonnegut. They wanted to be suitable for schools and general usage. 128 pages, and they wanted to be breaking down Vonnegut. That's the title. And so they want to talk about not so much the themes of each book or how, you know, these things are created or the complexities that get involved in some of the criticism one would read about them. But, you know, if you're a new reader, as we've been talking, and you want to know, you know, what went into his books? You know, how did he get to this idea? My way of approaching it for this book is to explain those basic elements that stayed with him, and in one way or another are exhibited in every one of the books. I mean, there's no secret to the meaning of any Kurt Vonnegut book. You know, it's like, we're shitty to each other, we need to do better. And you can do that in every one of the books. That should have been the name of this
podcast. We missed our chance. We're shitty to each other, we need to do better. It's such a great name.
That's the episode, huh?
Yeah.
But it's the way he gets there that is the trip. And yeah, the plots are all like, wow. But when you take a look at, you know, what he's talking about, the elements that he puts into every book, they're exactly the same. Because not that he was stuck with a certain worldview, he expanded as life went on. But there are certain principal experiences in people that imprinted upon him what was good and what was bad in the world. And those are always being worked out in his books.
Great. Well, we're looking forward to it. And remember, you promised to come back on the show and tell us the mystery of the beginning of the book when you're ready to release that information. Don't give it to CBS or ABC or any of those little guys. Come to us. Right, Matthew?
That's right. Absolutely.
Well, Marc Leeds and Max Goller, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I hope people have gotten turned on to the idea of reading some Vonnegut, maybe to learn about being less shitty to each other and a little bit nicer.
And thank you for having us. It was an absolute pleasure.
Yes, very much. I mean, anytime I get to talk about this stuff, I feel like a better human.
Yeah, and you don't have to wait for his newest book. You can go pick up the encyclopedia right now. If you're in Carlisle, Whistle Stop's got it because we were bringing Marc to town to sign books and meet people. We had to postpone that a little while. Now COVID has postponed it a little while longer, but you will be here and you will be here to sign those books when people get them. So pick up the encyclopedia.
I'm very much looking forward to that.
Yeah, it'll be great fun.
And thank you for having me today.
Yeah,
it's
awesome.
great to see everybody.
Indeed.